Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 7th Manatt Phelps Lecture in Political Science. This lecture series was established in 2002 to bring to Iowa State University a leading national or international figure in politics and the economy. We've had a series of tremendous speakers, government officials, international diplomats, and business leaders. And tonight's speaker continues that tradition through his international leadership in promoting human security. We are very grateful to Ambassador Charles Manatt and his wife Kathleen, and Ambassador Manatt's business partner Thomas Phelps and his wife Elizabeth for their generous gift, which allowed the establishment of this lecture series. And Ambassador Manatt and Kathleen are with us tonight. They're both Iowa State University alumni, so we'd like to ask you to stand and so we can thank you. Ambassador Manatt has served as chair of the Democratic National Committee, a former U.S. ambassador to the Dominican Republic. He chaired the Clinton-Gore campaign in 1992, and he co-founded with Thomas Phelps the Manatt, Phelps, and Phillips law firm, which today is a leading international law firm with over 450 professionals. I also want to thank Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean Mike Whiteford, Jim McCormick, and the faculty and students in the Department of Political Science for organizing this lecture. And a special thanks to our distinguished speaker. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And I'd like to ask Jim to come to the podium to formally introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, President Joffrey, for that warm welcome. On behalf of the Department of Political Science, I would like to add my welcome and to thank you for joining us for this 7th annual Manatt Phelps Lecture in Political Science. As President Joffrey noted, this lecture series has been made possible by a generous gift to the department by Charles and Kathleen Manatt and Tom and Elizabeth Phelps. We are privileged, as the President noted, to have the Manatts with us this evening. A couple days ago, I had the opportunity to talk to Mr. Phelps, and he sends his regrets that he and Beth could not be with us tonight. He is, however, leading a global economic conference today in Los Angeles, so his work complements our efforts here tonight. Indeed, as was noted, the intent of the Manatt Phelps Lecture in Political Science is to bring to campus each fall a prominent scholar or practitioner in the area of political economy who will speak about significant developments that have occurred in that area over the past year or so. Our aim is to make this annual lectureship the premier event on international political economy here in Iowa and really beyond. I believe that we have already begun to meet that standard. We are particularly pleased to have such a distinguished speaker to address this lecture theme tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Lloyd Axworthy, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg and former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada from 1995 to 2000. Dr. Axworthy's distinguished accomplishments as a political leader, as a global humanitarian, and as an educator make him eminently appropriate for this important lecture. A native of Saskatchewan, Dr. Axworthy received his BA from United College, now the University of Winnipeg, and his MA and PhD in political science from Princeton University in 1972. He went on to a political career that spanned some 27 years, with 6 of them spent in the Manitoba Legislative Assembly and 21 of them in the Canadian Parliament. During his tenure in Ottawa, he served in several cabinet posts in Liberal governments, including as Minister of Employment and Immigration, Minister for the Status of Women, and for 6 years as Minister of Foreign Affairs. In that latter role, Dr. Axworthy introduced the concept of human security as a foreign policy goal and sought to embed that concept into Canadian foreign policy, and indeed into global policy. His greatest success related to that goal was the issuance of the so-called Axworthy Challenge. In October of 1996, he called upon the global community to develop an international treaty to ban anti-personnel landmines worldwide. Through Dr. Axworthy's tireless efforts, and in little more than a year's time, the Ottawa Treaty was completed and signed by more than 100 nations in the Canadian capital in December 1997. The treaty was and remains a landmark achievement in affecting human security of so many from the plague of landmines. Indeed, Dr. Axworthy was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his leadership on this issue. His efforts to expand human security did not stop with this important treaty. He was also a strong advocate for the creation of the International Criminal Court and for the Protocol on Child Soldiers. For those latter efforts, he was awarded the North-South Institute's Peace Award and the Patrick J. Leahy Award. Although Dr. Axworthy left public office in 2000, he continued to contribute to efforts at expanding global human security. Not only has he recently written an important book about this topic, but he was appointed by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan as a special envoy to assist in implementing a peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And he continues to serve on the High-Level Commission for the Empowerment of the Poor as part of the UN Development Program. He also serves as a board member of the Canadian Landmines Federation, the MacArthur Foundation, Human Rights Watch, and several other international councils. Since 2004, Dr. Axworthy has served as president and vice chancellor of the University of Winnipeg and has led that institution on a number of important transformations. For his many humanitarian, educational, and public service contributions, he has received the Madison Medal from Princeton University, the CARE International Humanitarian Award, the Order of Canada, and several honorary doctorates from Queen's University, Dalhousie University, and from the University of Winnipeg. As you can see, Dr. Lloyd Axworthy is uniquely qualified by background and experience to discuss with us a wide variety of global issues. In this sense, we are especially privileged this evening to have him present a Canadian conversation with the new U.S. President as our 2008 Manat Phelps Lecture in Political Science. Dr. Axworthy.
Well, good evening, everybody, and first let me begin by admiring the skillful editing abilities of Professor McCormick, who clearly was able to paste together out of a somewhat checkered career something that almost has some semblance of reason and purpose to it. So I thank you very much, Jim. Mr. Ambassador, Kathleen, Mr. President, Madam Provost, deans, faculty members, students, friends of the university, people from the community, thank you very much for joining with me tonight for a conversation. It, for me, is an enticing invitation to be here, as you are just on the eve of a momentous occasion in the history of the United States, and if I can be so bold to say, for many others as well. And it's always tempting for when you've been an old political warhorse for close to 30 years to sort of all of a sudden feel those pangs and urges once again, even though I have since been neutered as a university president. And when Jim McCormick was driving me in from the airport today, mentioned that Mr. Obama will be in Des Moines tomorrow, I sort of immediately called my wife and said, look, can I take the weekend off? She reminded me that my family is sort of joining us in Winnipeg tomorrow night to pay homage to my mother, who will turn 93 on Sunday. And she said, if you leave me to have to clean up the house all by myself, you know where your brother won't be sleeping. So I'm afraid I have to desist from what would be a very tempting exercise. But it is very exciting to be with you and to share in what I can palpably feel, a sense of real electricity, of current running through this community and throughout, in terms of that great democratic exercise of making a choice. It's probably one of the rarest privileges in the world, and it creates its own particular atmosphere that is nowhere else. And I've been in lots of places where so many people are ever denied that wonderful opportunity to make a choice. And it takes me back to my days when I went through 9 different elections in my political life. And I can tell you from a personal experience that when the polls were closed around 8 o'clock and the counting really wasn't going to get mobilized to around 9 o'clock, I used to take to my bath with a good glass of single malt scotch. I would savor that and contemplate the incredible incongruity that some 100,000 people in my particular constituency in downtown Winnipeg had actually gone to the polls that day and made a choice that was going to not just determine my future, whether I had a job or not, but just this incredible exercise. When you think about it, what an incredible, amazing sort of exercise of volition, of political will. And I used to simply contemplate and said, what a rare experience it was. I wasn't always quite so enthralled when the polls were a little closer than I thought they should be, but nevertheless, that singular moment of reflection to me was always something that was good for the soul, and it does give a statement, I think, for all of you who are participating in this exercise. And as you know, Churchill, when he finally retired after many years to a quieter solitude, said that you can get some solace and salve from political toil by living simply with hot baths, cold champagne, new peas, and old brandy. And I thought, what a better epitaph for somebody who's been in political life. And as I said, of course, I took a somewhat different course. I ended up going to the serenity of academic life. I found out very quickly, one of my colleagues had told me that being a president of a university was something like being a caretaker in a cemetery. You had lots of people under you, but nobody listened. So I thought that one of the attractions of this invitation is there may be some of you along the way who might sort of pick up a word or two. But I would also like to say that my last visit to Iowa, I was just trying to count, was about, well, I won't give you the exact count, but well over 40 years ago. When I was at graduate school in Princeton, one of my roommates was a very honorable Iowan from Traer, and as you might expect, we would have a lot of debates. He would always talk to me about the sort of sterling virtues of the Midwest and of Iowa in particular, and I would, of course, lecture him on the wonderful sort of socialism of public medicine in Canada. You might imagine we would have a few discussions about that. However, I used to lose it all because about that time they would turn the news on television, roommates and I, and of course there'd always be some forecast saying a cold front's moving in from Canada. And people would give me a withering look, so I was always at a disadvantage geographically in that kind of debate. But I could tell you, going back that far, that in my experience of being a student down here and back in the 60s, being involved in things like civil rights movements, and it was an incredible time for conversation, which is why when asked what I would like to do, I'm not here as a lecture so much as I am to engage you in a conversation, and through many of you, sort of the next president, because in a democracy, that's how the views get expressed, that they move up and down in this area. And I thought I should begin the conversation by first telling you a little bit about Canada, because I do know from experiences that Americans are not always as, let's say, as broadly well-informed about who we are and what we do. Again, I can tell a small anecdote. When I was a foreign minister, our prime minister at the time, Mr. Chrétien, was going to do a tour across the northern swath of the states in the United States. He was going to Chicago Foreign Relations and Los Angeles and places, and he came to me and said, so can you give me a little bit of a primer on what Americans think of me? I said, well, I guess we can. I went back to my department, ministry, and said the Prime Minister would like to know what Americans think of them. And everybody kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, maybe we should do a survey of some kind. So we kind of commissioned one of these sort of focus groups and things of that kind. And when I got the results back, I immediately thought this was another career-enhancing move to tell them what the results were. And every time I go to Cabinet on Thursday morning, he'd say, well, so where are the results? And I'd say, well, it's taking us a little while to get them assembled, Prime Minister. Not quite there yet. And finally, he kind of threatened that if I didn't sort of divulge this state secret to him, that I might find myself doing national revenue or something of that kind. So I finally said to him, well, you have to understand that this is an imperfect science, polling, as we all know. And he said, get to the point. I said, well, the point is that the best-known Canadian is Pamela Lee Anderson. And, of course, acting as a straight man, he said, well, tell me why. I said, well, because I see more of her than anything else. So that's one thing, is that there is a certain sort of, I would say, divergence, because in Canada, of course, we live and breathe and are extremely attuned to the ways in which this wonderful, powerful sort of neighbor of ours to the south that occupies the same geography and rock works and thinks and acts. But as we also know, there's been some very, especially in the last 10 years, incredible integration of the two countries on some very vital areas, and we try to keep it a secret. I take it there's no sort of journalists in the room, because this is kind of in a cone of silence. But we're your largest trading partner. It's not the Chinese, not the Russians, it's us. And in fact, I did a little calculations. The Canadian Embassy helped me out and said that in this congressional district alone, District 3 in Iowa, some 3,000 employees are directly employed by Canadian industries working in this part of Iowa. And if you think of it in broader terms, about 80,000 jobs in Iowa are supported by trade or direct investment by Canadians. And I would say to you that it works reciprocally on our side of the border. So at a time when we're in this sort of economic tumult, and where we are seeing just how broad and deep the connections and links and interrelationships are, what we do know is that it's not that we just occupy the same space of geography. We are also each other's best neighbors, traders, investors, activists, and that is something that is not generally known. And yet I think it is probably, if I can be so bold, and one of the things, if I was talking to either one of the candidates, say, when we talk about energy independence, you should recognize that we have the second largest sort of fossil fuel reserves in the world, and that now most of them are exported in the United States. And if you turn on your lights and your natural gas pipes, you know it's coming from the Peace River Valley or from southern Saskatchewan. And so when we're talking about energy independence, it's not American independence, it's talking about a North American plateau that we're dealing with. And I'm not here to kind of polish the apple. I'm just simply saying those are just some of the realities, to say nothing of the fact that if you look at the exchange of people, although with the latest sort of border security issues, we're now creating some of the largest parking lots in the world along our interstate highways connecting into Canada. But in terms of the exchange of people, of ideas, and increasingly of political cooperation at a regional level, we really are joined by the hip. And one of the reasons we want to have a conversation is because it's important that we have those discussions, and our honorary consul will know that better than ever, because he deals with it on a daily basis of just how closely entwined we are, but also, and it was the great dilemma of all, when I was in office, of how do you maintain that kind of important series of connections and relationships and still maintain your autonomy and independence of action. When I left government in 2000, I was finally able to go and visit Taiwan, because up to that time we had an embargoed passport when we were in government, and I was invited to give a talk at Taiwan University. And I was a little jet lagged, so I wasn't kind of quite as swift, and after I kind of gave my talk, there was a young man going by the back, and he said, so, Minister Axworthy, you were Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada for close to 6 years, and you live next door to the most powerful nation in the world. He said, well, we live next door to a very powerful nation as well. Do you have any advice about how to make it work? Well, normally I would have had some very smart young Foreign Service officer slip me a note, something like, keep it simple, stupid, you know, something elegant like that. But I was kind of on my own. That was the first time I didn't have my briefing notes or talking points with me. So I kind of reverted back to an old Manitoba saying, which is, well, when you make love to a porcupine, do it carefully. I don't think it translated to Chinese very well. In fact, I kind of knew it didn't, because the next morning I went to one of these power breakfasts, you know, they have in Taipei. You got up at 5 in the morning to talk about how you do business and stuff. And when I came into the room, I could tell that there just wasn't quite the same warmth. Nobody was looking at me or talking to me. So I said to my host, look, have I committed some little protocol problem here? I mean, he said, well, it may have something to do with the story in this morning's paper. I said, well, what's the story? He said, well, it reported your talk last night. And I said, well, you know, my Mandarin's not so good. Tell me what it was. He said, well, it was reported that when you were asked on how to deal with these powerful countries, you said, well, it's a little bit like making love to a concubine. So now, you think if this is a new theory of foreign policy, we could probably develop it along the way. And it does show somehow that language and translation become important. But it also, I think, makes the point that this is a very finely tuned, finely grained relationship that has to be worked at. And I'm not sure we work at it enough in this North American context. I mean, I know as a group of Americans, you've got a worldwide encircling set of responsibilities. But when you think about it, North America is our home. And it's shared with Mexicans and with Canadians. And it's going to be the place in which we are sort of deeply involved in sort of trying to work out problems, because for many people around the world, what we do about our way of organizing our boundaries and our frontiers is going to be a model, has been a model. The International Joint Commission, which was established over 90 years ago to try to manage water issues between the two countries. Now almost moribund because of the particular view in Washington that they don't agree with international tribunals making judgments. But the reality is that we have pioneered in a lot of ways of trying to find the right sort of level and dimension and finesse in allowing each of our communities to exist as a community with our differences and our views, but at the same time to really learn how to share and how to be able to find the right level of cooperation. Not on the European model level. I mean, we're not talking about European Union, total integration with centralized institutions. We're talking about finding something that allows us, enables us to work together, to find resolutions of our common issues and differences, but to do it in a way that respects each other's identity and sense of community. Because community is really what it's about for so many of us. And I think that is one reason why, for those of us in Canada, the president election taking place here is of such importance. Because we realize that whoever is in the White House or who are in the Congress or in the state legislatures will very much impinge and result. And you know, it's not a popular thing, and I know a lot of Americans get upset and say, well, what do all those foreigners think about things? But let me tell you something. You do make a difference to us. It is important. It is crucial. And it's not that we're going to be casting ballots, although my sort of one of my senior executives is from Philadelphia, and he's had a kind of a double whammy this week. He voted for you-know-who, and he owns the Phillies one, so he's the only guy that's gone to the meeting of the Board of Regents in a Phillies shirt. I had to tell him not to be quite so exuberant next time, but it does matter. And I guess what I wanted to have a conversation about is with a new administration coming in, where do we navigate together in this tumultuous time that we live in? Because I think it's very clear that the global landscape is going through almost the underlying shifts of the geometric plates with all the conventional wisdoms, all the sort of assumed answers about markets and state and globalization have been fully ruptured in the last couple of months if they hadn't started many years before. I think what we're seeing in the reflection of the economic sort of burst that has really been brought upon us, you could say has been equally demonstrated time and time again in a less dramatic way. The incredible incursion of around the world of international crime and terrorism, which affects us all, and which no one country, even the most powerful country, is not capable by itself of managing. And it has to find ways of coagulating and cooperating to make things work, because you're dealing with worldwide networks. And that is probably, if I could underline a word, we're dealing with networks these days. We're not dealing in the old 19th century nation-state to nation-state issue. We're now dealing with networks of people, of certain governing groups, of factions, of warlords, of militias, of drug traders, of you name them. But they set up a whole new set of risks. And what we've learned is that we're not being particularly astute, any of us, and I'm being bold enough to say include everybody, of how to make sure that we assess those risks and respond to them carefully. Certainly the economic sort of explosion that's taken place is a demonstration that a lot of very smart people in our financial houses didn't know how to measure risk. And we're now paying one hell of a price for it. And not just sort of in with the people with the red suspenders, but there's an awful lot of people. You probably saw the statement by Ban Ki-moon, the new Secretary General, that said that, of course, all those with who are reasonably well-to-do are hurting. But can you imagine what it's like to be a street vendor in Calcutta? That's not hurting. That's full-scale disaster, because all the currencies are being completely shredded, and whatever kind of traction that was being developed in developing some form of redemption against the abject poverty of 2 or 3 billion people has now been set back, as Ban Ki-moon said, 20 years. And nobody was set out to do it. I don't think anybody was being malicious. But the tumult that we're in clearly transcends boundaries. And the idea that we are still kind of working around that kind of concept that we inherited from the Westphalians back in the 19th century, frankly, gives me some dismay. And so one of the other things I'd like to say, and the President and Jim McCormick talked about in their introductions, when we were coming out of the end of the Cold War, and we're something of the same kind of way in which the conventional wisdoms and the standard answers were no longer able to be applied, we started thinking through a little bit, well, what is it that we're trying to do? And that's where the human security idea, because to put it in the simplest terms, it means that the security of individuals and people is as important as the security of nation states. Now, that's not a widely accepted or broadly agreed to consensus, but I can tell you, as Canadians, we began to feel, let me give you a reason. My first 2 weeks in office, I was given a letter of mandate from my Prime Minister, his Foreign Affairs Minister, say, your first job is to protect Canadians internationally. So all of a sudden I find that there was a young Canadian couple from Montreal who got involved in a bombing in the Paris subway. A group of Canadian business persons were blown up over Mozambique. A young nurse from Alberta was hacked to death in Chechnya. A group of our tourists were kidnapped in Colombia. And all of a sudden I realized that if I'm to live up to my job, which is fundamentally to protect them as individuals, I can't do it by myself. That I have to start connecting with all those other players, international institutions, other countries, other police forces, in order to simply provide basic protection for Canadians who work, live, travel, or visit or study abroad. It's not a huge revelation, but I just simply realized that I was working with a set of tools that had become very dull. And to use the scholarly version, that the paradigm no longer explained the reality. The framework didn't fit what we're doing, or to use it, I always saw myself basically as a plumber when I was in government, fixing leaks. But then when I realized there was too many leaks, that somehow the architecture had gone wrong, and that we had to redesign the architecture. And that's when we came up with the human security idea, to simply say that as we proceeded in our international contacts, and that what we were interested in doing was as much finding of ways of developing international standards or practices or norms that would protect people regardless of they're Cambodians or Canadians or Colombians. We simply had to protect people. And that was, in effect, the basic responsibility of the sovereign state. You know, I don't want to, there's probably too many good political philosophers in this crowd. I didn't want to get into a debate about Thomas Hobbes or anything, but I simply said that sovereignty given to a government is not a divine right, it's earned. And it's earned by the way in which it protects its people. And if it doesn't protect its people, then it begins to abandon its right to declare its sovereignty. And goodness knows there's enough bad actors around who've demonstrated that time and time again. Now, I know that it pushes the limits, but I'm asking to have a conversation with me about that, because I realize that it's not saying that the nation state and its sovereign existence should be thrown away for some kind of world federalism or whatever. It's simply saying that that nation state is still the vehicle of protection if it does it, and if it doesn't do it, then there's got to be some answer to it. And it was one of those kind of things where it wasn't just an abstract kind of concept, it was how do we put it to work. And to go back to if I could, just a small example of the Landmine Treaty, we had a very broad coalition of civil society, which actually started here in the United States. The Veterans for Vietnam, coming out of their war experience, provided the leadership of saying that here is a weapon of war that no longer works. It just kills too many innocent civilians. This was born in this country by a coalition of veterans who simply said, we're the ones, we pay the price, but we also know there's a lot of young men and women and children without legs or without their life who've lost it because when the war is over, the landmines stay in the ground, and somebody foraging for food or water or to plant a crop, we're going to come across one of these hidden killers, and all of a sudden the explosion takes place. And they had the foresight to provide the financing to start an international coalition. And I want to, if I might, pay particular tribute to one of your senators, Senator Patrick Leahy, who was the first legislator who took to the U.S. Congress a resolution for the banning of the use of landmines. I mean, that was real gutsy leadership at the time. And I think you know that Pat Leahy over the years has shown that. But that was leadership. But it gave a kind of a momentum to a broad network of civil groups who involved victims from Cambodia, small countries, the Norwegians, Mozambiques, Thais, Chileans, all those who had experienced the horrendous experience of a landmine, of a country filled with landmines. And they started to try to mobilize to get an international agreement to stop their use. And where we came into play is that they came to us and said, okay, where do you stand? And we said, we basically agree with the thrust, but they said, no, that's not good enough. We're not a sovereign state. We're not a government. You have to pitch in and use your authority to help pull other countries together. And that's when, in one of those moments of, when Harry Truman said the buck stops here, I said, okay, I will issue the call. And everybody in Canada thought, he's really kind of gone over the bend this time. But to the surprise of all, 120 countries came signed. There's now 168 countries who have signed. And just to give you one small example, in 1997, the fatality rate with landmines was 80,000 people around the world. This year it was 12,000. If you can save 60,000 lives a year, then I think you are providing protection for people. And that's what human security is all about. And that's the kind of conversation I think we should have, because I believe strongly that the enormous power and influence of the United States, lending its weight to those kind of human security initiatives, could substantially broaden and deepen the commitment of the norms and standards that we have. And it comes at a time when it's necessary. I mean, this is not some kind of boutique operation we're talking about. You've got newly emerging countries, China, Russia, Brazil, India, sort of second rung, Indonesia, sort of Mexico. Many of them don't buy into any norms or standards. It's a free-for-all. It's back in the old 19th century. And if those of us who have become used to living under a rule of law that applies to us not by exception, but by a rule, then it simply gives license to all the rest of them to say we don't have to play by the rules either. That is the hard reality. That's part of what, as a Canadian, I want to have a conversation about, is that what happened in the end of the Second World War with American leadership on the Bretton Woods organizations to deal with economic matters in a coordinated fashion. The development of the United Nations as an instrument to try to bring countries together, fitfully as it may be, was very much an initiative coming out of the Roosevelt White House at that point in time. And I'm not being partisan, I'm just saying that's history. And there are many other examples I can use, but surely to goodness, at a time when the world is in such stormy waters, the most powerful country in the world needs to be able to say, where do we navigate to? Is it to simply be on our own, or do we join it? Are we part of a convoy that works together and sails together and protects each other? Particularly because there are a lot of marauders out there who won't pretend to do it. And it's not, let me say to you, a matter of choice. I think it's becoming a matter of necessity. If we don't find sort of those kind of alliances and coalitions and networks to work on it, then we will find that what we thought was the sanctity and security of North America will be sorely tested. Let me give you a working example that I think I certainly feel directly, and I think increasingly numbers of Americans are feeling it directly. When we talk about the impacts of climate change, climate warming, however you want to describe the science of it, direct north of here, 1,600 kilometers thereabouts, we have what's called the Arctic. It's probably the most precious, delicate, fragile ecosystem in the world. It's also the area where the ice is melting so fast that we're within about 10 years of having that long sought-after Northwest Passage where there can be trade and traffic going from east to west. It has, in one hand, a revolutionary impact on trading routes around the world. I was talking over dinner to the ambassador and others about what would happen if all of a sudden you've got open water and through the port of Churchill in northern Manitoba up on the Arctic Circle, you're able to start providing an entryway for goods and services to travel down the middle spine of North America, right sort of past Iowa and the Dakotas and through Oklahoma, right into Texas, into Mexico. You have totally and completely rewritten all the transportation routes of the world. And by the way, there's a lot of people thinking about that. I was at a meeting in Berlin at the early part of September, conversation between the European Union and the United States about the impact in the Arctic. And they invited me as a Canadian. I was kind of, the token. And I said, some token, we control 2/3 of the Arctic Ocean, so pardon me. Well, we say we control it. We really don't. But what was intriguing about it is the intelligence estimates coming out was that all of a sudden the Chinese are now getting very interested in resources under the Arctic Ocean, becoming fascinated by what would happen if they could avoid going through the Malacca Straits along Malaysia, where all the pirates are, and start moving goods and services from Europe and North America into East Asia. Boy, have you changed the economics of trade and transportation. But on the other side of the ledger, you can't have that incredible potential opportunity if you don't have some rules, because you're not going to have tankers wandering around the Arctic Ocean, blasting into a berg and letting their tanker oil, hit the cold water, because once it does that, it spreads to every other water circuitry around the world. I mean, the Arctic Ocean really is, in effect, a gyroscope. It circulates everything that comes in and out. But instead of all of us in the Arctic Circle, Americans, Canadians, Scandinavians, Russians, Europeans, getting together and saying, okay, let's get some rules about trade, transportation, fishing, protection of fauna, protection of the rights of indigenous people. What are we doing? We're back in the 19th century planting flags, declaring our sovereignty. This belongs to me, it doesn't belong to you. And we're going to be in a conflict and confrontation, the likes of which we haven't seen since the days of the Wild West. Now, what the hell are we doing to ourselves? Surely, in the year 2008 or 9, we should have learned by now. You can't make decisions that way anymore. But there we are out there pounding our chest, raising the flag, sort of, all of a sudden playing as if we were, back in kind of pre-colonial days. And I think we have a stewardship. You do, I do, because we both have a large part of it. Even the governor of Alaska has it, I think. Should have it. Because as much as you want to drill, if the drilling bit goes off hole, then you've got an ecological disaster on your hands. To say nothing about my friends the caribou, and the polar bear, and the beluga whales, and all the rest who sort of use that part of the world as their breeding grounds. And yet, folks, you would be dismayed and upset if you knew how little discussion is really taking place. We established as part of our human security agenda what we call an Arctic Council, which brought together the circumpolar countries and the Inuit people of the north from all the countries, the Sami, Inuit, from every country. And we started saying, let's start kind of working together. And they really were the first impetus to start doing studies of impact in the Arctic of the way in which the climate is changing. But it's since been put on the shelf by different governments, including my own, by the way. Not just yours, my own. The new government, not the one I belong to, the new one. That's not acceptable. That is not what I call not just stewardship, but if you come down to that basic principle of human security, then we are really negligent. And the price we pay is it may not happen quite in my lifetime or yours, but it's going to happen if we don't establish a proper set of rules to govern what takes place, and then attract the potential, which in terms of rekindling a form of international trade and discussion could be a real catalyst for us. Because you would bring down so much of the prices on transportation and productivity that you would really provide a whole new incentives for a kind of worldwide exchange. And by the way, those of us who are in the Midwest of North America, we're front and center in that proposition. We're kind of right in the cockpit of trying to make those decisions and make that work. That's how human security works. Because your interest in it is protecting people, and we're not playing sort of the national sort of brand on our shoulders. We're simply saying we're all in it, and we have to find some way of making sure that we all get protected by it. Let me give you, if I might, and I know that we're basing our time, but one of the most important sort of ideas in our conversation together is what I like to call the responsibility to protect. It's a direct outgrowth of the human security concept, and let me tell you how it came about. All of us were involved in the Kosovo in 98, 99, when we knew that hundreds of thousands of people were being ethnically cleansed, where there was murder going on. We had already been through Rwanda. We had already been through sort of Srebrenica in Bosnia. We already knew that there is this unfortunate and horrible system where some people just are bad, maybe even evil, and they kill other people without any reason, simply that they for history reasons or religious reasons or whatever. They just go and kill people. And at the time, nobody really had quite a good feel about how to intervene and do it in a way that was acceptable and workable for the protection of people in Kosovo. Again, I give credit to Winnie Rowan. I think Madeleine Albright played a very courageous role in helping to organize coalitions around that issue, of which we were part. But I didn't like the way it was exactly done. And I know that the Secretary Albright didn't, because it wasn't according to rules. I'm a big believer in international. You got to have rules to give certainty to these things. So in discussions I had with the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, we said, so how do we find some way that we won't allow these things to happen again? The genocide, crimes against humanity, use of rape as a weapon of war, violation of child soldiers will no longer be accepted as a standard of behavior in this world. And that if countries aren't able to sort of stop it, or they don't want to stop it, then we will, as an international community, take some responsibility. So we agreed that we would set up a commission. It's called the International Commission on Sovereignty and Intervention. And we got together a lot of smart people from around the world. It was very much funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation here in the United States, to do the legal work. We went back into every legal tome, going back to the ancient days of just war. And we came up out of that commission with a concept called the responsibility to protect, shorthand R2P. Here's what it simply means. That if there is a crime against humanity, and that can be defined according to the Rome Statute, there's 4 or 5 clear crimes against humanity, and the nation-state government in which that crime was committed is unable to protect its own people. Simply, it's a failed state. The warrant of the president doesn't go beyond the palace grounds. They simply have no capacity. Or if the government is unwilling to do it, they just don't want to get involved in protecting people. Or the government itself is the predator. It actually is the one who is doing the murdering. If those are the kind of triggers, then it should set an alert that the international community has to take some responsibility for the protection. And I don't mean marching in right away. I mean using all the tools of diplomacy and statecraft and sanctioning and shaming and naming. I mean, the toolbox is pretty big. It's not been used very well lately, but there's a lot of ways that you can begin to provide ways of curtailing behavior, restricting behavior, deterring behavior of things you don't like to see. But it does mean that there has to be a responsibility to begin to take that on, using all that spectrum of things. And finally, maybe at the very end, if as a last resort, you may have to decide that there is going to be an intervention using military means, not in a massive invasion, but means appropriate to the end, which is not to change a regime or to change an ideology, simply to provide protection. The kind of thing that, look at, you read today what's going on in the Congo. You've got a massive movement in eastern Congo of tens of hundreds of thousands of people. And the UN force, 17,000, the largest peacekeeping group in the world, is unable to do anything about it because the Security Council wouldn't give them a mandate to offset the kind of rebellion and militia warlord stuff that's going on. And what are we doing? Well, you, me, my country? What, did you hear a newscast about it? Have you read about it? Maybe if you get in the New York Times, it's on page 17. Nowhere else. We're letting it happen again. It's going on. Same thing is going on in northern Uganda, where I know your provost has spent time, so have I, up in Gulu. It's happening up there. It's been happening for 20 years, and we're letting kids being kidnapped and absconded and murdered and turned it into mutilations, and we say nothing. Darfur is probably an incredible example of how everybody knows just how horrendous, and by the way, you know, it's also a product of an ecological crisis, because when the land and the grazing grounds dried up, the nomadic tribes started moving in on the agricultural tribes, and you got a war. Nasty one. And there was 2 years of debate till we finally got some agreement to have an international involvement, but the international peacekeepers can't go anywhere because nobody will give them, they're all from African states and they don't have the helicopters or the communication equipment or the logistics or the intelligence, the normal things that you need for this kind of mission, because nobody will give it to them. Americans won't give it to them, Canadians won't give it to them, French won't give it to them, Europeans won't give it to them, nobody will give it to them. So what do? They sit in their base, and the murder and the crime and the humanity and the raping goes on. Now R2P, was actually passed by a summit of world leaders in 2005. This is not some kind of boomerang idea that's sitting out there in cuckoo land. It was passed by world leaders. It was become a protocol of the Security Council. But what's missing from it is, how do we now implement it and make it work? And I got to tell you, I was heartily sort of encouraged when I read in the New York Times last Tuesday, there was a big front page story comparing Mr. Obama and Mr. McCain's different foreign policy stances. And way back in the back part, in the middle section, the fact that Mr. Obama has enthusiastically accepted the idea that R2P should be a principle to be looked at by U.S. foreign policy. Now, he's not going to talk about that in the campaign, because you know what happened. There would be 14 different ads saying, "Oh." But I got to tell you, if one, and I think even Mr. McCain, while not as openly vocal, has said that he thinks it's an idea worth looking at. Boy, if you could take that, then I'll tell you, we Canadians will be with you right down the road saying, we know something about it. We put the idea out there. We've looked at how it makes it work. Just think what a difference it could make in this world if you had that kind of coalition. Not something where you're marching it, but you really pull together that kind of communal effort to stop the murdering and the plundering and the raping that's going on around the world. And maybe to take it into one level further, and this will kind of maybe make you shift in your seats a little bit. Maybe even the R2 principle might evenly be applied to the impact of what's going on in the climate and the environment. Because I'm not being an alarmist, I'm simply saying, in terms of fact, I see it happening in the Arctic where civilizations are being ruined. Shilawatt Kluche, who's the president of the Circumpolar Council of Inuit, has now taken the United States, specifically, to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, saying there's a form of cultural genocide being committed, simply because of the excessive use of fossil fuels, and it's getting out of control, and therefore the way of life of Inuit people is disappearing. Now, you can say, look, so, big deal. But it does show that there is slowly emerging a different concept that can be managed in a way, if we can grab a hold of it and do it in a collegial, corroborative, cooperative fashion. Now look, I say this in part because I'm in a university setting, it's a university crowd. These are the things that our universities have to be working on across the world. These are the sort of things, it's not going to happen right away. I mean, policymakers, I can speak from some experience, they don't have a lot of time to think through implications and how it works and what's going to happen and what are the political fallouts. That's got to happen in the think tanks and the universities and the policy groups and those who are learned to kind of think about these things and to get it certainly introduced and energized into the political system, where it becomes part of the conversation, both at the diplomatic level but also in the domestic level. And just starting to think that if we really are looking 20 years out or even 10 years out, and it can be in the Arctic, it can be in the rainforest, it can be in the killing fields of Darfur, you name it. There's an awful lot of human tragedy and pain taking place. And I believe that those of us who have been privileged to be endowed with a good living and a safe environment have some responsibility to protect. And that's one of the conversations that I as a Canadian would like to put forward. It's not going to be an easy one. There's lots of people who still get upset by it. They think this is some form of new imperialism because partly we've been giving bad examples about how military action can be used. And that's where I think that we can begin to sort of recheck some of these issues and for goodness sake do it together. Let me then just close by saying I do believe that we also have, in very specific terms, an opportunity to apply it within our own North American context. Because I've been talking about the transgressions around the world. We also start talking about what's happening in our own sort of basic regional context. I think we all know how fresh water in North America is increasingly becoming in short supply, partly because too much of it's toxic, partly because it's in the wrong place, and partly because we're just using an awful lot of it that we shouldn't be using for all kinds of purposes. And that's happening. We in Canada like to say we have 15% of the world's fresh water. Yeah? Not so much anymore. Because, and here's where the cycle gets big, some of the freshest, most potential reservoirs of fresh water happen to be in the same location as the tar sands in northern Alberta and the Yukon and the Alaska. And to create one sort of barrel of oil out of a tar sands extraction takes 120 barrels of fresh water out of the Athabasca River. So when we're talking about energy independence, my friends, believe me, some of us have got some real concerns. And I know that part of the election campaign here is what do we do about NAFTA? You know, I was part of I was the sort of international trade and foreign affairs minister in Canada when these things were negotiated. And I thought it was pretty good to bring us together on a trade issue. But it's outmoded. And I think and I'm not here, please, I'm not here, but Obama is right by saying it has to be looked at again. It has to be, because of the environmental, resource, energy, climate issues that are connected to it. And maybe we don't have to do it in NAFTA. Maybe we should have a new energy, water, climate agreement between Canada and the United States and maybe Mexico, and around which we get together to start holding conversations. I learned a great lesson. And let me just give one final story. Back in '98, we used to, when I was a foreign minister and Secretary Albright was there and Secretary Rosario Green from Mexico, we would get together about 4 times a year in what we called the Three Amigos Club. I was the kind of guy amigo, I guess. My Spanish is not so good. But we would get together in different parts and talk about some common issues. And we actually started, for example, an experiment, a pilot project, on looking at water basins that cross our borders. The St. Croix River, the Red River Valley, the Columbia, where we share this precious resource. Started saying everybody in that water basin has a common interest. People who are in agriculture, hunters, swimmers, recreation, all. The successor to all 3 governments, when they came to power, disbanded that kind of consultation and conversation. And here I'll give you an example of how it made a difference. In the summer of '97, I was up with my son on Black Lake in northern Saskatchewan. Your president was up there close when he was up God's Lake. 70 mile an hour, pure, clean, fresh water, 7 boats on the entire lake. We took off on our old sort of de Havilland, and as we flew over the water, we just saw this pristine area. I then got to Winnipeg, got on the government plane, and flew to Santa Fe, where we were meeting. And I got there, I said, hey, it's kind of dry around here. And the cab driver says, oh, yeah, if you spit, you get a medal. And so I went to the meeting, and as the guys were pouring the water for lunch, I said, you know, isn't it kind of funny? We have these conversations 3 or 4 times a year. We've never talked about water. And I could see my officials, you know, beginning to cower, saying, oh, my God, he's done it again. You know? They don't want us to talk about it. It's too dangerous. You may get it's too controversial. You know, it starts talking about how do we share it? How do we distribute it? What do we do about it? That's the first time that senior officials in the 3 countries have ever sat down to talk about probably what is the most precious, vital essence of our life as a civilization in North America, and that's our use of water. But the conversations have stopped. They're not going on anymore. They're not being pushed by people in my university or Iowa State or in the chambers of commerce or whatever else to say, hey, get a hold of things. Get a grip. You've got to start doing about these things. And that's where I think the conversation is so important, because we can do things here, and if we find some effective, cooperative way of handling our own stewardship in our own continent that we all share in a way that is respectful, but sharing, and mindful of the protection of people in terms of their rights, whether they be sort of an indigenous band who have fishing rights that go back historically, or fishermen who have been in an area, or recreation, that we all recognize how we can come to grips with that particular area. Then I think we begin to make some sense, and human security becomes an applied area that the rest of the world starts looking at and saying, well, if they can do it, so can we. And so that's what I think that, the old saying that chaos is the creation of new ideas. Creativity comes out of tumult. And that saying of Teilhard de Chardin, that we're all aware that there are portents of important things happening in our life, but what is it? Now's the time, with the political changes going on and all the old structures now being challenged, now's the time to ask that question of what is it? We can start here. I would hope that we could start here in the Midwest, because I think we all have some good, solid, sterling virtues in this area. but I think we can also start doing it as a way of dealing with the issue, 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 as a way of